This episode is made possible by our Patreon supporters: Monique Tuttle, Julie Gray, Bree Smith, Robin Brown, Janelise Cannon, Jamie Lang, Jill Harrigan, Maria Carla Sanchez, Heather McKinnon, Chantel Oliver, Valerie Jacobson, Lindsay Cummings, and Michaela Frew. You can become a patron for as little as $1 a month and help us create new episodes of the podcast. Hi, Katie.
Hi, Olivia.
I am going to read you a few pieces of a United States presidential political platform.
Oh, goody.
And I want you to guess.
'Tis the season.
Yes, it felt timely. And I'm going to ask you to guess which candidate or even which party this might be from.
Okay.
We must attack the root causes of poverty and eradicate racism, hatred, and violence. Minorities among us suffer disproportionately, long disadvantaged in our total society by race, color, national origin, creed, or sex.
Okay.
We must give increasing attention to the views of the young and recognize their key role in our present as well as our future. We recommend a nationwide shift to a shorter than 40-hour work week without any loss of wages, with higher minimum wage and stronger employee protections to strengthen the economy and quality of life for American workers. Air and water pollution, already acute in many areas, require vigorous state and federal action, regional planning, and maximum cooperation among neighboring cities, counties, and states. We encourage priority attention by all levels of government to the rapid development of affordable high-speed rail between all major U.S. cities.
Wow!
Vigorous effort must be directed toward increasing the application of science and technology, including the social sciences, to the solution of such pressing human problems as housing, transportation, education, and environmental pollution.
Dang.
We pledge a relentless attack on economic and social injustice in every form.
Wow.
All right.
Okay, so out of the context... Okay, so if this weren't in the context of a historical podcast, I would say that is the platform of a probably far left independent political party in this year's campaign.
I do this exercise with my students often, and yes, they often ask if this is AOC's platform.
Yeah.
Or the Green Party, or some extremely far left, super liberal, super progressive, super modern candidate. This is the 1968 Republican Party platform for the presidential campaign of Richard Nixon.
Oh my gosh. 68. That's a little bit depressing. I mean, it's maybe a lot depressing that those exact goals that are now 50 years in the past is the same thing we're still talking about. Wow.
And that, I mean, not only could no Republican run on this platform now.
Yeah, wow.
No Democrat could run on this platform now.
Yeah, that's why I was saying it has to be somebody who's considered to be like a dreamy radical.
Yeah, this would be so off the charts, impossibly progressive nonsense. As a national presidential campaign platform.
Yeah.
This would absolutely never fly.
Yeah. Yeah. Look at those generational pendulum swings.
So, why are we talking about Richard Nixon's platform?
Yeah, why are we? Because there's got to be a woman involved.
Yes. Because, as seems to be the case, almost any time you dig into these stories,
hey.
there was a woman behind Richard Nixon who was somewhat important in shaping his political and personal views, who has been wildly mischaracterized. Luckily, we have returning guest, Heath Hardage Lee,
Oh,
to help us fix that. Because her new book, The Mysterious Mrs. Nixon, reintroduces America to one of our most influential and misunderstood first ladies.
Huh.
And an absolutely fascinating human being in her own right.
cool.
I'm Olivia Mickle.
And I'm Katie Nelson.
And this is What's Her Name?
Fascinating women you've never heard of.
I'm Heath Hardage Lee. I'm a historian and curator with a focus on women we think we know, but we perhaps do not. And my latest book is The Mysterious Mrs. Nixon, The Life and Times of Washington's Most Private First Lady.
Heath Hardage Lee, of course, author of League of Wives and guest on our episode on Sybil Stockdale, acclaimed historian, author, museum curator, and delightful human being.
I know next to nothing about her, so this is cool.
She's been incredibly neglected, and obviously a large part of that is that little thing called the Watergate scandal
Yeah,
that made it awkward and embarrassing to talk about the Nixons.
yeah.
And this is the first book Mrs. Nixon has had in almost 40 years. Due to a little scandal, which now looks like an even smaller scandal called Watergate, the source of all the gates that come after, but really in the end, compared to today, looks kind of dime store. But Mrs. Nixon, because of that scandal in the mid-70s, her husband, Richard, resigns, and she, along with him, goes into exile. And that is why she really has not had a commercial biography since the one her daughter wrote in 1986.
I bet that's annoying. I bet that was annoying for her. The dumb thing your husband did
Yes.
ruins everything you did.
Very much so. And a recurring theme through this episode is going to be, if Nixon had just listened to his wife,
Oh.
everything would have been fine.
Oh, fascinating.
What I think is so hidden in plain sight with Pat Nixon is her Western upbringing. She's born in 1912 in Ely, Nevada, which is this tiny little town literally in the middle of nowhere, close to what now we call the loneliest road in America. Desolate highway, there are like scrub pines everywhere. It's an old mining town. And so she's born in this just desolate kind of area. Her father is a miner, a very dangerous occupation. Then she moves within a couple of years to Artesia, California. So she is very Western.
Being from the West also means that she has a degree of independence and a sort of assumption of independence as a woman that doesn't happen on the East Coast as quickly or as much.
As you know, the Western areas of our country, the women there get the vote before their Eastern sisters do. So suffrage comes early, and independence is just a fact of life for women on the Western frontier, whether they like it or not. They are not as coddled, I think, as their Eastern sisters tend to be. So Pat grows up with a mother and father that are both doing everything they can do just to survive, to stay alive, to make enough money to feed everybody. So I think that Western outlook and a dislike of hierarchy, which starts very early in her life, and you will see this later in the White House when she becomes First Lady, come into play.
She has absolutely no time for that kind of social posturing nonsense. We talked about this in League of Wives quite a bit, actually, that at the time, wives of military officers assume the rank and social standing of their husbands.
Yeah.
And so you are expected to defer to the wives of men whose rank is higher than your husband.
Yeah.
all of this is ridiculous nonsense to her. She has absolutely no interest in these kind of king of the hill wrangling hierarchical structures.
Yeah.
People are just people.
Amen. Amen, Pat.
Yes, as Westerners ourselves.
Yes. I completely agree.
This is hugely influential in the way she looks at the world. A very DIY kind of person, a pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of person. And also, like her future husband, Richard Nixon, she is a striver. She wants to get out of that. She wants to see things and do better, educate herself, and get out of there, which she does.
Unfortunately, her parents die very young.
By the time she is 13, her mother has died of Bright's disease. And by 17, her father will die of silicosis from his time in the mines.
By 17, she is raising her 2 younger brothers and running the household. She helps put her brothers through school.
Wow.
Essentially, all 3 of them kind of raise each other at this point. She helps put her brothers through school, and then they help her get through school.
Yeah, if you're raising your younger siblings when you're 17 on a small farm, I feel like that's a recipe for being on that small farm for the rest of your life.
Yeah, she never should have gotten out.
Yeah. Fascinating.
But she was determined to get out. And it sounds like all of her siblings were determined to help each other get out.
But she goes to college, very unusual for women at that time, and has to have multiple jobs at a time to put herself through school. She works at a bank. She works sweeping things up. At college, she's working, doing research. At times, she can just barely keep her head up to listen to the lectures, but she still excels in school and eventually gets the equivalent of a master's degree, quite unusual at the time, and sets herself up very well to be an independent career woman. She can support herself.
She is teaching high school economics.
Huh.
And she goes to audition for a play with the Whittier Community Players. And at the auditions, she meets this boy named Richard Nixon.
I was going to say run away, but maybe not.
I think he's so complicated and he did so much good stuff. That's why I find him fascinating. He was great.
Yeah.
Until he wasn't.
Yeah. And he ruined everything. He ruined his whole legacy.
Everything.
Yep.
Did you know Richard Nixon was a theater kid?
No. Oh. I guess it makes sense. You're a performer. Huh.
They met at a community theater audition.
Wow.
He was bowled over by her amazingness, and fate was sealed. It makes it very different when I think about him as a theater guy. I don't know, like...
It makes them real people.
I think one of the most important big reveals in this book is the nature of the Nixon marriage.
People have this idea that they had a loveless marriage, which is completely, utterly incorrect. That's one of the many myths that I take a sledgehammer to in the book. And I came into this, as I always do, I try to have an independent-minded historical look at things. So I didn't have a dog in this fight proving one thing or the other. You look at the interviews, you look at the archives, and what I got here were new letters, too, that had not been released before, that the daughters, Julie and Tricia, allowed me to see.
Richard Nixon passionately pursued Pat Nixon. He was head over heels in love with her. He was all in on marrying this woman that he could not get enough of. She is 26 years old. She is an old maid.
It's over for her.
Yeah.
She missed her chance.
She should just be absolutely desperate to get married. And she is not.
She is this fully formed, independent career woman, and she doesn't really want to give that life up. He pursues her for several years before she agrees to marry him, including making him take her to her dates in LA with other men and drops her off and picks her up at the end.
What? Nuh-uh.
It's terrible.
Fascinating.
But also it makes me laugh so hard.
Wow.
I love that little subversive, sense of humor she has in making him work for this. This is not easy. But he's also a tough customer and very focused. And he sets about winning her, another historian says, the way he later would set about winning elections, like single-minded pursuit.
Okay.
And she sees something in him that attracts her. He's going places and he's going to get out of Whittier, and that's what she also wants to do. The war comes about in 1942. Eventually, they are married. He's in the Navy in just a very sort of cushy job, but it's boring and he's bored.
Eventually, he does get himself into more of a combat position. Off he goes to the South Pacific.
So he's there at the same time as our grandpa.
Oh, I wonder.
I
if
wonder.
they crossed paths.
Wow.
She stays in San Francisco and works for the OPA, the Office of Price Administration, as an economist.
And he kind of complains to her in letters. He says, you have a much bigger job in the war than I do.
Mm-hmm.
What you're doing is way more important than what I'm doing.
I mean, she is doing all this cool stuff during the war there. She's on her own. She is having a great time. But the World War II letters will blow people's minds.
Richard is extremely in love with his wife.
Richard Nixon, as I said, is just smitten with her. And the letters between them during the war, I mean, he is so proud of her, loves to show her picture off. He makes her go take this beautiful sort of glamour shot that he shows to all his friends. And he is just so proud of how smart she is, but also how beautiful she is, how she looks like Greer Garson, the movie star, which she does.
And she had been an actress. She was an extra, a bit player in Hollywood in the 30s.
She was in a number of movies, Ben-Hur being one people might know.
What?
Future First Lady Pat Nixon
Nah.
was an extra in Ben-Hur.
Holy cow.
So she has this fascinating life before, after, during the marriage. They're finally reunited. And in 1946, Richard Nixon wins the eye of some local Republican sort of fathers in Whittier. And they cultivate him for political office. He agrees to run against a liberal Democrat, Jerry Voorhees, for the House of Representatives. And he wins. This is the first big election. Pat backs him fully. She wants to do everything she can do to support her husband, who she knows politics has always been something he's wanted to do. She put some of her inheritance into paying for campaign literature. She sees firsthand how dirty politics can be when people steal a lot of these things she's paid for. And that's disheartening. But she believes he will be president someday. She says that very early on to a friend, oh, Dick will be president someday. So she sees this spark that he has. He's in the House of Representatives, then wins in 1950 in the California Senate race versus Helen Douglas. And by 1952, so in only 6 years, he is going to be running on the Eisenhower ticket as his vice president. I mean, it's a pretty meteoric rise. And a lot of this is thanks to Pat.
It is a well-known fact that she is his secret weapon. They are called the Pat and Dick team. And they are 100% working together on all of this.
Pat and Dick, like she gets first billing? That's telling.
They are a team. They are campaigning together. She is his best advisor. She is his counsel, the one he really listens to. And for much of their marriage, it is the Pat and Dick team. And I would say where this really comes into play the most is in 1952 with the Checkers speech. So Checkers is their spaniel that the family is given as a gift. And Dick Nixon, the VP candidate, is accused of having a slush fund where he has this extravagant lifestyle funded by his Republican donors. Not true, just all part of politics. But Eisenhower is not coming to the rescue. He is thinking about dumping him.
Richard Nixon comes to Pat and says, I want to completely open all of our family finances to the American people. I want to show them everything. I don't know many people who would go, yes, honey, let's do that. Let's show our entire personal budget and bank accounts.
Now, Pat is horrified by this whole thing. Nothing could be more upsetting for a Depression-era person who has had to save and scrimp for everything they have to have your finances laid out on national television.
But she agrees, and she is sitting there next to him on TV as they walk through their finances.
Wow.
For the nation.
And at the end, he says, well, that's it. That's everything we have. Pat doesn't have a mink coat. She has a good Republican cloth coat. And I think she would look good in anything.
And the good Republican cloth coat becomes sort of an icon of his campaign and his presidency.
Interesting.
Fiscal responsibility, frugality, not showboating, not showing off. Especially when you remember who he's going to be running against for president. This becomes a pretty important decision, right? When you are up against the Kennedys, that's a sharp line to draw.
And then he says, the only thing we're keeping from this is Checkers. We're keeping the dog. We are not giving that damn dog back.
Well, that would convert every dog person out there.
Yeah, it becomes this iconic moment.
Totally.
There's several points where Richard Nixon says, I can't do this anymore. This is too brutal. I'm done. I'm quitting. I can't do this.
He wants to give up. He says, Pat, I can't do it. And she says, you cannot quit. You can do it.
You have to keep going. Look at what you could accomplish. Look at the difference you could make. You have to do it.
So she gets him through that. Eisenhower wins. He becomes the vice president.
And Pat becomes the second lady for 8 years.
She and Mamie have an interesting relationship. They become good friends over time, but Mamie is a bit of a spoiled military wife. I know military wives well from my previous book, The League of Wives, and she is used to being the senior military wife and being deferred to. And poor Pat, who is so busy being the mother to 2 little girls while Mamie is, sleeping all day and putting face cream on and making people watch As the World Turns with her favorite soap opera. Pat is just, this poor woman, her whole life, she is working so hard for other people to support them. Her husband, the first lady, she takes over a lot of hostessing duties for Mamie because Ike actually has a terrible heart attack while in office. And the Nixons really do take over presidential entertaining duties, state dinners, etc. for a time while he recovers. And Mamie also just doesn't have the concept of First Lady as a working girl.
Pat Nixon treats the job of Second Lady as a job, and Mamie Eisenhower does not.
Oh, interesting.
For Mamie, it is a position. For Pat, it is a job. We can't entirely blame Mamie. That is how it was. And this is part of the evolution of the First Lady role. For Mamie, it was more of a see and be seen thing, but for Pat, it was a job. So she goes all over the world at Eisenhower's request. They go on goodwill missions, promoting the United States, working on diplomatic relations, and Pat is Vice President Nixon's best asset. They are almost killed in Caracas in 1958 by a communist mob that spits on them, jeers at them, and eventually tries to assassinate President Nixon in his car. Pat is in another car. Rocks are thrown, shots are fired. They barely escape with their lives. That's a very dramatic event that is all over the press, and they are welcomed home like conquering heroes by Eisenhower. So Pat has, of all First Ladies, the best possible, most extensive preparation to be First Lady, I would claim, of anyone in the history of our country. People have forgotten this. People don't even remember she was Second Lady. So then we get to the 1960 election. So we have John F. Kennedy in 1960 running against Richard Nixon. And it is this epic duel between them. But what people also don't know is that John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon were good friends. They were junior senators together. They had worked together. They admired each other. The Nixons were actually invited to Jackie and Jack's wedding. He declines it to play golf with Eisenhower. If I were Pat, I would have been like, you are not playing golf with Ike today. We are going to the wedding of the century. But, you know, whatever. Ike is his boss. He is the president. I guess he didn't have a choice. But in this election, they are pitted against each other, and the First Ladies are pitted against each other. I have a chapter called Jeweled Jackie versus Drip Dry Pat. They are set against each other, which is very unfair because they were friendly. There was never any animosity there, but the media's got to set that up. And also JFK and Nixon were friendly. And if you look at the television debate from 1960 between them, there is a civility and a mutual admiration in a low-key way that we just don't see today. It's very issues-focused. What are we going to do to fix this on each side? It really is something we all ought to look at as a model of what a good debate should be versus what we have today.
In the press, they're pitted against each other. Fashionable Jackie versus Drip Dry Pat.
Ha!
But behind the scenes, that's not the reality. Mutual admiration ruled the day.
Huh.
So, he loses.
So we have that bitter defeat from 1960. And the newsreels show Pat crying, which she hated. But he can't stay away from politics.
And so he decides to run for governor of California. And he loses that too.
He makes several Freudian slips about running to be the president of California. His heart is not really in this governor's race, and he betrays that pretty early on. So he loses that election. Then there's this long, beautiful period in New York, which I think is the happiest period in Pat Nixon's adult life, perhaps. He is a lawyer in a private practice. She is in New York City, going to the theater. They both love musicals. They're going to the museum. Her daughters are growing up. They're going off to college. She has time to go have a Sunday at Schrafft's with them. She has time to be home when they come home from school to be with them and just hang out. It's a beautiful period for the family. They have a lot of family time together. And this is a period she will look back on very fondly. And her two girls, Julie and Trisha, look back on very fondly.
But politics is always there in the background.
There is no real mistress in this marriage ever, but the mistress is politics, and Nixon cannot give her up. So in 1968, they're back again. Pat does not want to do it. The girls are unsure, but always all want to support their father, their husband, in this effort. So they go back into it in 1968. Yet again for another round. And this time, Richard Nixon wins. So Mrs. Nixon is still a little shell-shocked, and I think still not dying to be First Lady. She'd really like to be out of politics. But once again, she turns it on.
Pat Nixon once described the First Lady as the most difficult unpaid job in America.
I believe it. I bet it's the most thankless job, too.
Yes, and it doesn't have to be the most difficult job. She could watch soap operas.
Yeah, she could Mamie Eisenhower it. Yeah.
She is not capable of doing that. When she is handed an opportunity to make the world better,
yeah,
she has to do it.
We have Vietnam to deal with. This is a wartime presidency, so they are surrounded by protesters. There are threats all the time. There are snipers protecting everyone. So I think people have forgotten that time period. It was very fraught. Pat becomes the first lady who goes into a combat zone. She risks her own life, like she did in Caracas as the second lady, goes in and is visiting soldiers in the hospital, going into a combat zone. And she meets with the wounded. She takes letters home. It's very remarkable, and nobody has done that until Pat Nixon. Then she starts doing things like, in 1970, going to Peru. This is also groundbreaking. She goes as a solo ambassador for her husband. This has not happened before. We did have Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, doing some things like that. But this is the first time a first lady goes bringing emergency supplies and humanitarian aid to Peru after this horrible earthquake they had. She goes without the president and brings supplies, money, food. She visits hospitals. She and the First Lady of Peru go around the country trying to get the press in so that other countries will bring aid, which they do. So this is also a remarkable thing that she does.
She creates tours of the White House for the blind and the disabled that no one has ever done before.
Ah.
She lights the White House, which has never been done before.
Jackie Kennedy, of course, starts the White House renovation and restoration program, but Mrs. Nixon brings in more art and artifacts than any other First Lady before or since.
She is adamant that everyone on staff refer to it as the People's House. This isn't the presidential mansion. This is the People's House. And she makes sure everyone remembers it.
Now, in the background, while all these achievements are going on, that she's, by the way, getting almost no credit for because she hates that, her press secretary, Connie Stewart, is desperately trying to get that out there, and she's trying to tamp it down.
And then,
Whack, whack.
In the West Wing, we're dealing with Bob Haldeman, who I see as a bit of the Darth Vader of this story. He is a Madison Avenue advertising executive. And I call this part of the story Mad Men Take Over the White House. He and a lot of his colleagues who he recruits to come to the White House with him, many of the folks who work for him do like and respect Mrs. Nixon, but Bob Haldeman does not. This is when there is a real attempt to isolate the First Lady, the daughters, and also the old Nixon staff, the old campaigners, those who have been on the campaign trail with him early. They're all isolated from the president and shut out.
it is no longer the Pat and Dick team. She and her staff are moved to the East Wing.
Wow.
And Richard's staff are in the West Wing.
They are having an epic battle of the sexes, and there's a lot of battle by proxy here with Haldeman and his minions, and then Mrs. Nixon and her staff trying to get her programs out there. And they keep tamping it down because they, in my opinion, don't want her popularity to eclipse that of the president's. Even when the president is saying, I want Pat in the press, I want that out there, they're trying to tamp it down. And the sexism is just, even for the 70s, is pretty epic. And this is all to his detriment and leads to his downfall with the Watergate scandal.
It is clearly these men that are doing it. Richard is letting them do it. He's the president.
Mm-hmm.
He can talk to his wife anytime he wants to.
Wow.
But they are activating and enabling his worst characteristics, let's say, that Pat has been very effectively tamping down in him.
The next election in 72 is a landslide. Nixon wins by a landslide against George McGovern. This is fantastic. But unfortunately, there is a little break-in at the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate. This little thing, nobody thinks it's that big of a deal. No one pays that much attention. Over time, becomes a bigger and bigger story, in part due to the Washington Post and efforts of two young reporters, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. Suffice it to say, Watergate mushrooms. It becomes a huge problem and eventually is going to lead to President Nixon's resignation on August 8th and 9th of 1974. And after this, he and Pat will go off to San Clemente in California and will live out some of that time post-exile, sort of putting their lives back together.
And the media representation of her is really fascinating and infuriating. First of all, these rumors start that she is a drunk, that she is just drinking all the time. There is absolutely no evidence of this anywhere at any point ever.
Wow.
And Woodward and Bernstein are the ones who push this narrative.
Ew.
From where I cannot figure out that she is a drunk and a recluse.
Wow. Slimy.
I'm trying to figure out how famously the most involved and public first lady is a drunk and a recluse. But if we've learned anything, it's that narrative is more powerful than the evidence of
reality.
Your own eyes.
Yeah.
There's zero evidence, first, for any kind of drinking. No evidence that she was ever an alcoholic. This was a Woodward and Bernstein claim in their book, The Final Days. Also, that she was reclusive, another claim that seems to be stuck in the American mind. Also not true. These are mythologies that need to be hit with a hammer and shattered to pieces. And I try to do that with facts, with reporting based on interviews with people who knew the Nixons and those who were a bit on the outside. people who were babysitters for the grandchildren, people who were Air Force One pilots, staff, friends of the family. She was working right up until 3 weeks before the president resigned. She was constantly at events all the time. And then even the last 3 weeks, she was working internally at the White House on the White House restoration renovation projects. So there was never a slowdown. There was no evidence that she had an alcohol problem. But I think this is so often true in the media. There are things that stick that may have no evidence, but people believe them. And it's so unfortunate that our first ladies are treated that way. I mean, I could do a whole book on first ladies and their minimization in history. But at the same time, you're aggrandizing their role. They have too much power, they have not enough. They're not active, they're too active. So I do take down those myths. And then to go back a bit, the plastic Pat myth, which predates the Woodward and Bernstein reporting, that is that Pat was a sphinx, she was enigmatic, she never had any opinions. Totally not true. She was funny, she was down to earth, she really connected with people. She's very much of a one-on-one person. She did not like huge galas and state dinners. That was not what she liked. She liked meeting everyday people on the street. She made efforts to do that and meet people where they were. She's very much a woman of the people and someone who came up very poor and who knew that if you got a letter from the White House, you would frame it and this would be one of the great memories of your life. She really understood that.
I think if there's one consistency in the way that we talk about first ladies, it is that it is always their fault. No matter what the it is, we will construct a narrative that will make whatever the problem with the president is the first lady's fault. And I think, in my very pop psychology opinion, I think this is not just regular old garden variety misogyny, but also we voted for this man. We, as a collective, chose him. And so if he ends up not good, that's embarrassing for us. Unless we can find a scapegoat.
Yeah.
Oh, no, we chose the right guy, and then this woman brought him down.
Okay, yeah.
So whatever narrative will excuse whatever the faux pas was, be it Watergate or a sex scandal or any other failing.
Yeah.
Whatever kind of first lady will excuse that.
That makes sense.
Excuse us.
Yeah.
In choosing that, that's what we'll go with.
It's too painful to lose faith in this person you put on a pedestal, the president, or to realize you were wrong from the start.
Yeah, it's embarrassing.
So it's easier, easier to just be like, okay, I wasn't wrong, and we correctly put him on the pedestal, but then she wrecked it.
It was the woman. And now we come to one of the big mind-blowing revelations of this book.
Ooh.
Richard Nixon, in 1969, announced to his close team that he was going to appoint a black woman to the Supreme Court.
Wow.
In 1969, the first woman, period, on the Supreme Court, and he was going to appoint a black woman.
Okay, do it.
One of the big finds in the book, one of the big archival finds, was finding out that President Nixon had identified and wanted Jewel LaFontaine as a Supreme Court justice in 1969. I interviewed her son, John Rogers, about how outstanding she was. Jewel was on President Nixon's short list for really wanting her to be a possibility for the Supreme Court. But the good old ABA, American Bar Association, shut that down. It wasn't President Nixon, it was the ABA and how sexist they were at the time. You know, it is the 70s.
So then he tried to appoint a white woman and they shut that down.
Oh, they didn't want a woman of any color being anything on the Supreme Court.
absolutely would not do it.
Mildred Lilly is shut down, who makes it further than Jules Lafontaine, but she is shut down. But Pat was pushing behind the scenes big time. And then publicly, she wanted a woman in the Supreme Court. She said that publicly. She was pushing her husband to do this.
He still could have done it, I say.
Yeah. He just didn't want to have that political fallout of pushing such a thing. Interesting.
And his moral compass and spine has been pushed off to the East Wing and is not in the room with him.
Interesting.
But she was still very much in the room with him in his head.
And she was furious when it didn't happen. And Nixon was terrified. And he told the Attorney General, John Mitchell, he's like, Pat is going to kill me. What am I going to do? What am I going to do?
So I would like to once again point out, listen to your wife, Richard Nixon. He could have gone down in the annals of history.
Oh, man.
The man who appointed the first woman to the Supreme Court, instead of the dude who did a very incompetent break-in of the Democratic National Headquarters.
Wow.
Listen to your wife.
In terms of takeaways from her legacy, I think there are two things I'd really like people to remember. I would say these two legacies are her twin biggest legacies. One is her diplomatic efforts. From her time as Second Lady on, she used soft diplomacy behind the scenes, sometimes more up front, to help her husband, the president, seal deals. This happened with the opening of China in 1972. She became the face of the presidency, wearing her red coat all over China, a symbol of goodwill and good fortune. And that was not accidental. That was very much of an image that they thought about, they wanted to project. Behind the scenes, she helped in Russia. She would befriend the wives of the premiers there, with Khrushchev to later with Brezhnev and other leaders, and helped her husband also seal deals with Latin America, going to Peru, as we talked earlier, to bring relief and emergency supplies. Many people said she did more for relations with Peru than anything the president could have done. So her soft diplomacy, behind the scenes diplomacy, is unknown and uncredited, and that should be something people remember. The second one is what she did for women behind the scenes. She pushed hard to get women in higher levels of government behind the scenes, working with a woman named Barbara Hackman Franklin, who's a total rock star that we all need to know, to get women into the Nixon administration in visible mid to high level roles. Mrs. Nixon is pro-ERA. She is pro-choice. As I say in the book, she was ahead of her time, and now perhaps ahead of our time too, with her views. That legacy for women is something about Pat Nixon that really I don't think anyone knows about, and I hope they will take that away as her other big legacy.
Richard Nixon was one of the most passionate women's rights advocates we've ever had in the White House, which is completely not the narrative that I had ever anticipated until reading League of Wives. I was stunned by what was happening behind the scenes. And Pat is to be thanked for huge chunks of this. It really was this Pat and Dick team. She's making sure he is aware of women's issues on all these things. He genuinely cared about them, and he genuinely invested in these things. Such an amazing, what should have been historic legacy of right side of historyness on so many issues.
Would have had a woman on the Supreme Court. Watergate would not have happened if he had listened to his wife. And unfortunately, the all-consuming pursuit of power, as we know, for whoever you are, power corrupts. Power is a problem. The seeds of all this are planted, particularly with women, during the Nixon administration. Watergate it doesn't completely wipe that out. That continues. Those seeds blossom later. For instance, Sandra Day O'Connor is identified by Barbara Hackman Franklin during the Nixon administration. So there are seeds there that sprout later, thanks to Pat, thanks to policies during that time. But Watergate, unfortunately, shuts down so many things that were going in a positive direction. He is the most progressive Republican president, and Pat is the most progressive Republican First Lady, I would say, ever of all time. Title IX, the EPA, OSHA, and the ERA, all these amazing things, the Cancer Act. It's a very different type of Republican. So it's pretty remarkable, and Pat should be thanked for some of this. She was very humble. She hated the spotlight. She did not want that, and she would never, as we say now, toot her own horn. That was anathema to her. But that was often to her detriment because people did not know what she did and today don't know. So as her biographer, I love that I can toot Pat's horn for her because that is my job. I think people need to know what a spectacular job and what a remarkable job she did. This is the big lesson. Listen to your wife.
Huge thanks to Heath Hardage Lee. Visit our website at What'sHerNamePodcast.com, where you'll find resources, photos, and of course links to all of Heath's wonderful books.
You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, where we post lots of photos each week.
Music for this episode was provided by Aaron Kenny, the Mini Vandals, the Westerlies, Josh Lippi and the Overtimers, Doug Maxwell, Quincas Moereira, and the U.S. Marine Corps Band.
Our theme song was composed and performed by Daniel Foster Smith.
Our intern is Katie Boucher.
What's Her Name is produced by Olivia Mickle and Katie Nelson, and this episode was edited by Olivia Mickle.